Hello and welcome to the Gemhogs YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial today, we are going to learn to make the easiest bangle ever using flat wire or wire ribbon and some small beads to enhance that. It's a really achievable design. So let's head down to the board and take a look at the example. So we're going to take a piece of flat wire. I'm using 21 gauge, which is equivalent to 0.75mm by 3mm, and this is a flat wire, a little bit like a ribbon. You could of course use a very heavily hammered wire instead if you only have round available. I'm then going to use a secondary stretch of wire to add on some beads. This one has been made with 3mm faceted labradorites, and this one has some 2mm fire polish beads. I think they're both really pretty. They're both very comfortable to wear, and the sort of design that you can take off and on by yourself without any need for additional help. So let's take a look at the piece of wire to begin with. Pop that one up in the corner. So I have an 8-inch length, which works for around about a 6.5-inch wrist. So you can size up from there. 8 inches of the flat ribbon wire for a 6.5-inch wrist is around about the ratio you're looking for. So I've cut that, and what I've done is I've used not my posh cutters, but some extra cutters to get a good square solid end, which I've then used a little nail file on just to polish flat, so there's no sticky, uppy or pointy parts to cause any issues. So let's pop that down on the board. In terms of beads, you can use 2 or 3mm. Round shaped beads really do work the best, and faceted beads look absolutely stunning on a design like this. So I have got some 0.6mm or 22 gauge wire, and I would say keep this attached to your reel. And the reason I say that is because it's quite wire hungry, and it's much easier than threading all of the beads onto a loose piece and then potentially dropping it and allowing them to fall. The reason I don't have this on a reel now is because I've run out of 0.6, so we'll see how far we get with today's video. What you will need to do is add on plenty of those little beads. So these are 2mm fire polish faceted rondelles, which look really pretty. However, having done a second piece for you, that's Joey saying hi, with round beads in a 3mm, I would say anywhere between a 2 and 3mm, but the rounds look really attractive on this design. So entirely up to you what sort you use. What we're going to do is to measure just over 1/2 inch from one end. And I'm going to begin by rotating around that flat wire at least 6 times. So if I just take that a couple of inches over the end and start rotating around, what I'm looking to have happen is the cut end move out towards the short end, like so, and you'll need to keep those rotations nice and tight. So you can see that that's a little bit loose. Let's just tighten that up. And I think I will go for 6 wraps to end on the upper side. So I've got just a little bit of spare I can utilise there. You'll notice that that just moved along ever so slightly. So we will want to cut that wire midpoint on the upper side of that ribbon or flat wire. And the very end needs to be around about 1/2 inch from the end. So do feel free to grab your ruler to make sure that's about right. Once you're happy that those 6 rotations around the ribbon are nice and tight, and you can just squeeze gently diagonally across that wrap. I think I've only got 5 there. Give them a nice hearty squeeze, and that will just set that little bit. So let's get one more wrap. And there we go. So once I've got my 6 wraps and I'm happy, I'm going to give that a nice hearty squish. So because I'm right dominant, I'm just going to flip the design over so that the short end is over to the left. You can work in whichever direction you prefer. Once you have allowed that first bead just to drop down against that flat ribbon or flat wire, we're going to draw that finer wire, the 0.6 or 22 gauge, diagonally across the surface and then firmly down the back. Now when you're working with glass beads, you just need to be a little bit careful that you're putting enough tension to make that a nice tidy wrap, but not so much tension that you smash your bead. So that's sitting nice and neat and tidy with enough tension to keep it safe. And what we're then going to do is another 6 wraps. Now this does need to be nice and firm and tight around that ribbon. We're working with 0.6 because it's strong enough to hold those beads in position. That's a 4th wrap. That's a 5th wrap. And there's a 6th wrap. Let's get that nice and tight. Protect your bead with your thumbnail and then just squish that next section of banding so that it's good and tight. Make sure all of those wraps are adjacent and then drop in the next bead on the strand. You can work with a very long piece of cut wire if you prefer, but it's very boring adding all those beads on one at a time. So I do recommend threading it all onto the reel and working in that orientation. So hold your next bead in position. Draw the wire down across the back so you've got a diagonal pass of wire, and we've got 6 wraps between each bead. Continue all the way along, finishing with 6 wraps, and that should be an equivalent length from the end. So around about ½ inch from each end needs to be bare wire, and the central section needs to be filled with 6 wire wraps and then a bead going across at a diagonal. So I have that 8-inch length of flat wire. There's around about ½ inch at either end with nothing on it at all. And then all of the beads have 6 wraps of that finer 0.6 or 22 gauge wire, very, very firmly tied together between each bead and at either end. Let's move on to the next stage now. Do try to focus on keeping those beads at equal distances and also ensure that your little 6 wraps are banded neatly together. You can go along afterwards and squish those down, but you do need to be super careful not to hurt your beads, because if you do smash one, you got to undo the whole lot and start again. It's no fun. So let's work on these end sections next. In order to make this the easiest ever flat wire bangle, what we're going to do is to create a little bit of an addition point at either end. So we're on the upper face with those beads, and I'm going to use the smallest section of my bail making pliers to rotate firmly around. Now it can take a little bit of a start, making sure that you focus on bringing that around until you have almost a complete circle. The reason I stop before the end of that flat wire touches the remainder of the flat wire is because I want it to lift slightly as we start rolling around to the top. So if I just pop that tine back in and start pulling that around, what I'm going to do is put a little pressure down with my thumbnail and lift that roll of flat wire over the top, so that it can be a nice smooth transition. Now I'm going to keep rolling that until it sits just on top of that last cut wire. So there we go. And I'll repeat the same on the other end, and I'll show you that manoeuvre again. So your end section of the flat wire needs to be completely flat. We're going to start with the smallest pin on my bail making pliers. We're going to take that around just before it becomes a circular form, and as that tips over to just as it touches the remainder of the flat wire, I'm going to push down with my thumb, lift up with those bail makers and bring that over the top, and it means that you just get a much nicer roll in that quite substantial, it's 0.75 thick, but it's 3 mil wide, and we'll bring that all the way around until we get a nice rounded roll. Now if you find that a little bit of the inner roll sticks out, it's really easy just to redress that until you get those 2 really neat, almost Aladdin's carpet ends. Now when we're working with beads that have been pressed down onto a flat wire, there is a risk of, if you've pulled this so tight you might have shattered the beads. Well, we don't want any shattering of beads at all. So we're just going to make sure that that's as warm as it possibly can be. And what I'm going to do is to bring my rounded form. You can use a bangle mandrel, but I actually find it easier to use a rounded form just to create the two sides. And I'm going to very, very softly start to bring that around. I'm not bending too close to the end, and again it looks a little bit like a sleigh or a carpet there. So I'm going to come around about 1 inch from the end and just start pulling that around gently until you can get the beginning of the shape that you're after. So you could, like I say, let me just grab one actually, you could use a bangle form to get that shape if you wanted to, but because it's quite a springy wire, what tends to happen is you use that to make the form and then it bounces out much larger than you need. So I tend to make bangles in this way, just rotating around on that rounded form, and you don't have to have a special tool for it. Let's keep going at the other end as well until we get a form that kind of meets or starts to come together in the middle, but there'll need to be around about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches gap. So let's just have a look at that. That doesn't look quite right to me, so I tend to do quite a lot of my work using no tools at all and just using my hands to get that to sit how I need it to. That actually looks pretty decent to me. I've just dropped it down out of the focal range slightly, so I'll lift that back up. That looks like it might just about fit, so let's try that on for size. That's pretty much what I'm looking for, but do take your time to make sure that you're happy and leave yourself a gap of somewhere between 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches in between those two rolls of flat wire. So again, I find myself saying this quite a lot, but do just take your time. You'll be much happier with the end result if you ensure that both of the sides are even in so much as they're the same distance, and also that the little rolls come in the same distance from the end. So if you need to sketch that out on a piece of paper and then pop that on top just to use it as a guide, then do so. But we will now move on to that very easy to use closure. So overall, I'm quite happy with my wrapping and with the scrolls on the end. So what we're going to do now is take a 4.5 inch length of 1.25mm 16 gauge wire. 4 inches would probably do, but that's the length of the scrap I have. And what we're going to do is to turn a right angle about 1.5 inches from one end. And then I think probably we'll use step 2 to create a circular form. Let's roll that around and then draw the wire all the way across so that we get that round form on the end. If that isn't quite large enough when you get to what we're going to do next, you can just open it out slightly. Let me show you, open it out ever so slightly like so. That looks a little bit better. So what we're going to do is to slide that through one of these scroll ends. So let's just push that in. If you haven't left enough of a gap here, you can probably open that up by hand or just grab that with a plier to open it up. What we're going to do is just sit that in like so. Now we want that to be able to move, so if you use that number 2 step and your scroll is quite thick, then you may need to just make that a slightly larger round form. Just slightly larger than step 2 has worked really well for me. Then we're going to take this little residual tail and wrap it around the core a couple of times. So if I grip across that round form like so, not pressing down on the scroll and not pressing down where the wire crosses over, I'm going to draw that tail around at least 1.5 times, making sure that I don't make it tight. I want that to be able to wiggle around easily. Let's grip that very firmly and push that tail of wire all the way around. If you struggle to do that with your thumb, then do feel free to get a second set of pliers involved to help you out. I'll show you how to do that. So you can grip across that round form with your second set of pliers and then carefully, bit by bit, bring that tail of wire around. I quite like it so that it finishes underneath, and I'm going to make sure that that end cut is nice and flush. and just ensure that the tail sits very firmly and very flat down against that core wire. Again, it needs to be mobile in that little scroll that we made at the end. So ensure that those little coils around the central core wire are nice and neat. And then what we're going to do is to create an open little hook design. So I'm going to leave about, I suppose, 1/4 inch or so before I push the wire away quite firmly to one side. Not happy with that. Let's give that a squish. That's much better. I'm then going to use the largest size on my bail makers, or you could use a wooden mandrel or a pencil. And what we're going to do is to create a rounded form now. So let's go for step 6. Draw that all the way around and then back across on itself, like so. Not a perfectly round form, but let's give that a quick wiggle. Get that to sit nice and smooth. There we are. So that is going to be how large the bangle is when it's completed. So if that is too large for the wrist, if you left not quite enough of a gap or too much of a gap, then you can play around with this section of wire where this bend occurs to make that fit to your desires. So what I'm going to do now is put the smallest pin into that little J-shaped hook and draw that wire back, away and around. It's a bit ugly at the moment, it doesn't matter because I'm going to chop it halfway. Now this is one of those times where having a nice sealed circular form will look beautiful, but it will actually impede the function of the hook clasp. So what I'm going to do is to cut that halfway around the smallest circular form, the last bit we've just made, and then I'm going to give that a really nice rotate with my flat facing pliers. What we're looking to do is to kind of chamfer the cut end just to make sure that it's smooth and it doesn't hurt. Again, you could grab in your 4-step nail file just to make sure that that's nice and smooth and nothing is going to hurt you. The idea is that that will push through. Now, if you've got too much of a curve, which can happen, if your coil is quite small on the end there, then you can just take another bit away. Put my finger in the danger zone to get that little section caught. Give it another file. Give it another rotate with your flat facing, your chain nose pliers. Just rotating around the end there. If you do have a burr cup device, which I've got somewhere, then you can pop that on the end and just spin around until that's smooth. Making sure that your hook clasp closure is nice and flat. You could just separate that out, pop it on a block and give it a quick hammer if you wanted to. I'm just going to give it a squish with my pliers to make sure it's smooth, and then that will fit through the scroll and complete the closure on your bangle. And I will show you that genuinely they are take on and offable just by yourself, just by pulling that away. And there you've got a little stackable bangles there, all made very simply from that 21 gauge flat wire. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed the easiest ever flat wire bangle demonstration, complete with that you can do it yourself closure clasp. Have yourself a lovely day, and I look forward to seeing you back here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel very soon. Bye for now.